WCCO and Twin City Federal present Minnesota Milestone. Minnesota's marching men. A military story. From the beginning, military men marched in Minnesota. They kept the peace and they fought the Indian Wars, and the echo of the marching feet comes back to us now, back across the years from Bull Run, from Vicksburg, from Manila, from Chateau Thierry, from across the seven seas, from Bataan, Iwo, the Solomons, the Normandy beaches, Europe, Italy, Africa, Japan, the South Pacific.
Oh, hiya! And it sure ain't as wild as this. Yeah.
And that was Fort Snelling in its heyday, a busy, bustling, crowded, active place. For a time, Fort Snelling and nearby Mendota were the centers of life in early Minnesota. Everyone who came up the Broad River stopped at Fort Snelling, and there was a constant mingling of soldiers and trappers, Indians and settlers, riverboatmen. Minnesota Territory's first fair was held there. Alexander Ramsey headed for Fort Snelling when he was appointed territorial governor. But it was not always so. Long before the hustle and the bustle of civilization began, way back in 1805, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike arrived. His assignment? To select a site for a fort to be occupied by the United States Army in a new land called Minnesota. And for $200 worth of presents and 60 gallons of whiskey, Lieutenant Pike purchased from the Sioux the land where one day Fort Snelling would stand. It was late in August, back in 1819, that the 5th Infantry arrived under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Leavenworth. The troops set to work at once to cut timber for temporary cabins. The commander chose a site on the south bank of the Minnesota River where it empties into the Mississippi. He chose it because wood and water were close at hand. But Lieutenant Colonel Leavenworth soon learned his error. In the spring thaw, the floods rose and the temporary camp was underwater. In May of 1820, Colonel Leavenworth and his men camped in tents about a half-mile up the Mississippi from the present fort. They called the spot Camp Coldwater and used it as their base while they began building the permanent buildings at the fort. Colonel Josiah Snelling arrived that summer to assume command. The cornerstone was laid on the 10th of September, and 1 year later, Fort Snelling was occupied by the United States Army. But the frontier moved quickly beyond, settlers spreading along the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers and out to the Red River of the north. And Fort Ripley, Fort Ridgely, and Fort Abercrombie took over the task of guarding the newer frontiers. And then in 1857, Congress approved the abandonment and sale of Fort Snelling to Franklin Steele for $90,000. The troops were moved out, and then came the Civil War, and the government repurchased a portion of the original reservation, and Fort Snelling, as we shall hear, once again returned to a position of importance in the story of Minnesota's marching men. Hunters, attention! Today we'll attack that sometimes frightening problem of home ownership, the mortgage. Now there are two kinds. The kind that give your budget a battle each month and the kind that declare a quick truce. Then settle down and be neighborly. Good strategy calls for choosing the last kind first off. Therefore, I'd like to leave this thought with you. Twin City Federal is the Northwest's leading home financing institution. During the past 35 years, they've helped more than 95,000 persons in our area toward home ownership. They have all modern types of home loans available. The service is quick, courteous, convenient. Furthermore, all those years and all those homes mean that Twin City Federal loan counselors can offer valuable help. help they'll gladly give you in choosing your mortgage plan. So, to outflank financing problems, quick, march to Twin City Federal sometime soon. Or if, as I suspect, you'd prefer to drive down, remember there's plenty of free parking for you right at the door. Look for the twin clock flashing the time and the temperature in downtown St. Paul and Minneapolis. We return to our story of Minnesota's marching men.
Forward! Ho! Up, up, red, up.
The marching men returned to Fort Snelling in the 1860s. Once again, the stars and stripes snapped crisply in the morning sun, flying atop the staff there on the bluff. And men marched on the drill grounds. They marched in the dust and the summer heat. They cursed their sergeant, their officers, the weather, and the army, but they marched. Volunteer civilian soldiers, farm boys and clerks, downy-cheeked lads, undergoing the discipline that creates an army. April 12th, 1861. Minnesota's Governor Alexander Ramsey happened to be in Washington when the shocking news came. It had come, the thing all men had dreaded for so long.
Extra, read all about it. South fires on Fort Sumter. Extra. President Lincoln says war. Extra.
Ramsey hurried to the Secretary of War, an old friend, Simon Cameron.
Governor Ramsey, it's good of you to come and see me.
I felt I had to come, Mr. Secretary. I felt I had to come the moment I heard the news.
I'm glad you did, Governor. This is a terrible thing, Ramsey. A terrible thing.
I know, Mr. Secretary, and that's why I came. I want to help. That is our state, Minnesota, is still young, one of the youngest. But, sir, I would be proud if you would accept my offer of a regiment.
Mr. Ramsey, yours is the first offer I've received from any of the states. I am grateful.
The 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry was formed and drilled at Fort Snelling, commanded by Territorial ex-Governor Willis A. Gorman. Recruiting proceeded all over Minnesota with patriotic meetings. Volunteer companies formed, representing the settled communities in the state. Racial groups, institutions all joining. Hamlin University sent a full company led by one of the professors. And 3 times in succession, senior classes at Hamlin were broken up by enlistments. And the newly arrived immigrants, the men from Sweden and Norway and Germany, they answered the call too.
But some who volunteered were accepted for only limited duty. In this capacity, they did much useful work, but they were called the Invalid Corps by the combat soldier who made fun of them.
I wanted much to go to war and went to be examined. But the surgeon looked me o'er and o'er, my back and chest he hammered. Said he, you're not the man for me, your lungs are much affected. And likewise both your eyes are cocked and otherwise defected. So now I'm with the invalids and cannot go and fight, sir. The doctor told me so, you know, of course it must be right, sir.
By the 21st of June, 1861, Colonel Gorman reported that 1,023 officers and men of his regiment were ready. At dawn the next day, the regiment paraded at Fort Snelling and was addressed by the chaplain, the Reverend Edward D. Neal.
Men of the 1st Minnesota Volunteers, your errand on the mission upon which we are about to embark is not to overturn, but to uphold the most tolerant and forbearing government on earth. You go to war against misguided brethren, not with wrath, but with mourning in your hearts. To fight for a great principle is a noble work. We are all erring and fallible men, but the civilized world feels that you are engaged in a just cause, which God will defend.
Following those words, the men of the 1st Minnesota, dressed in their red flannel shirts, black trousers, and slouch hats, boarded 2 waiting steamboats. And half an hour later, the vessels rounded up at the upper levee in St. Paul. Minnesota's marching men landed, and there they staged Minnesota's first wartime parade.
Bye! Be careful!
And there on the levee in St. Paul, that 22nd of June, 1861, with the bands blaring and the flags flying and the crowds cheering, the 1st Minnesota departed for war. Young bloods in the regiment, anxious for their first taste of fighting, encountered it perhaps sooner than they had imagined. On the 21st of July, less than 1 month after its departure from St. Paul, the 1st had its baptism of blood and fire at Bull Run. It was one of the last Union regiments to be led forward on that sad day. In 32 minutes, 42 officers and men were killed, and 108 were wounded. Most of the Union troops broke and ran, but despite the general rout, Minnesota had reason to be proud of her sons. The 1st Minnesota held its ground until at last it was ordered to the rear. The men from Minnesota were engaged in the Battle of Ball's Bluff. The 1st Minnesota waged the entire Peninsular Campaign in Virginia. At Antietam, the regiment was cut to pieces. And at Fredericksburg, it underwent an ordeal of fire which only veteran troops, such as they, could have endured. It was at Gettysburg on June 29, 1863. Gettysburg, the turning point of the Civil War. That's where the 1st Minnesota distinguished itself with valor. 3 companies were absent on other duties that day, so only 262 officers and men were there for the blow at rebel lines. Early in the morning, the regiment was ordered nearer the battlefield. It took a position on a rise of ground where it could watch the opposing armies, and there it remained in reserve waiting for the order. Colonel Colville, commander of the 1st, could see Federal troops, outnumbered by the enemy, trying desperately to resist the Confederates under Longstreet and Hill. And they fell back, the Union forces, driven back by the withering fire, past the spot where the 1st Minnesota still waited. And the Rebs came closer and closer, advancing, and then came General Hancock commanding that part of the battlefield. He knew he needed time, just 5 minutes, time to bring up reinforcements. He saw the group of men on the hills, and he knew they would be sacrificed. General Hancock spurred his horse.
You, sir, Colonel. What regiment is this?
This is the 1st Minnesota, sir. Colonel Colville commanding.
Charge those lines. At once, do you hear? Charge those lines.
Attention! Port arms! Fixed bayonets! On the double! March!
The Confederate lines were momentarily disordered as the men climbed a small bank. The men of the South fell back under the withering fire. By dusk, the battle ceased. The enemy withdrew, and the heroic 1st Minnesota took its count. Of the 262 men who began the charge, 47 answered call. 215 lay dead, dying or wounded on the field of battle, in the pasture, on the slope, or in a swale below. Colonel Colville was seriously wounded, crippled for life. And General Hancock, the man who ordered the charge, later said,
There is no more gallant deed recorded in history. I ordered these men in there because I saw I must gain 5 minutes' time. I would have ordered that regiment in if I had known that every man would be killed. It had to be done.
It was in 1897, many years later, that a statue of a soldier running with his gun at bayonet charge was erected on that part of Cemetery Ridge from which the 1st Minnesota launched its charge. One of the highlights, another milestone in the story of Minnesota's marching men.
Let's lend an ear right now to some sounds of spring. Birds warbling. And new homes being built. Does that last sound fit in with what you've been thinking this spring? Time for a trip to Twin City Federal and a chat with one of their expert home loan counselors. Twin City Federal, as I mentioned earlier, is the Northwest's leading home financing institution. They've helped thousands and thousands of persons in all income brackets to become homeowners, and they'd enjoy helping you, too. Twin City Federal is conveniently located at 8th and Marquette in Minneapolis, 6th and Robert in St. Paul. Look for the twin clock flashing the time and the temperature. Look for quick, courteous service, plenty of sound, helpful advice, and sound financing. And if you wish to drive down, don't hesitate. You park free, you know, and you park right at the door when you do business at Twin City Federal.
Seems like I just hit the sack. Hey, Jorgensen, you better get yourself out of there before the Sarge comes around. Now, where's my shoe? More drill today, I suppose. Drill.
The summer of 1862, and men did drill and drill and drill some more. Back and forth they marched, column right, column left, about face, snap it up, look alive. Each day brought more recruits to Fort Snelling on the Bluff. Each day saw finished companies, finished and ready for the all-consuming battlefields of the Civil War. And then came the news. The Sioux had gone on the warpath. Settlers were being murdered, men, women, children, slaughtered in their cabins that dotted the sprawling Minnesota River Valley. Settlements were burned. Minnesota had trouble at home. And for the Sioux, crowded on their reservations, it had been a troublesome year. The summer before, the corn had failed, and now, hungry, angry, and sullen, they gathered at the Yellow Medicine and Redwood agencies, awaiting payments the government had promised them. And as they waited, they looked hungrily at the storehouses filled with food. Their eyes narrowed as they watched the traders who stood guard. The Indians were angry and resentful, but they departed, and war parties attacked the following day. They fell upon the traders grouped around the Redwood agency, shooting them down without warning in a wild massacre. Some of the braves spread around the countryside, killing settlers, burning their farms. Others joined the Sioux forces, which set out to attack Fort Ridgely in New Ulm. Governor Ramsey issued this proclamation.
To the people of Minnesota, the Sioux Indians upon our western frontier have risen, attacked the settlements, and are murdering men, women, and children. The uprising appears to be concerted and extends from Fort Ripley to the southern boundary of the state. In this extremity, I call upon the militia of the Valley of the Minnesota and the counties adjoining the frontier to take horse and arm and equip themselves, and at once report to the officer commanding the expedition now moving up the Minnesota River to the scene of hostilities.
In response to Governor Ramsey's proclamation, the settlers did come to join Minnesota's marching men. Squads of men, mounted and on foot, armed with rifles and pistols and shotguns, poured up the Minnesota River Valley. And within 3 days, Sibley had a force of some 1,400 men, including about 300 cavalry. And across the prairies they marched, along the rutted, muddy roads to St. Peter, to Fort Ridgely. 1,600 marching men had joined Sibley's force by the time he met the Sioux in the Battle of Wood Lake. There on September 23rd, the Sioux were decisively beaten, were driven across the border into Dakota Territory. For the next 5 years, they made sporadic raids into Minnesota, but by the 9th of October, 1862, the Sioux Indian uprising was considered at an end. More than 300 captured Sioux faced military trial at Mankato, and 38 of them were hanged publicly.
And the men boarded steamboats at Fort Snelling, the paddle wheels churning the waters of the Mississippi and the Ohio to the Civil War fields of battle. The 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th Minnesota regiments joined the 1st. The marching men from Minnesota fought under Grant at Vicksburg. They were in the Battle of Chickamauga. They marched with Sherman to Atlanta and the sea. They took part in the famous charge up Missionary Ridge. They heaped glory on themselves at the Battle of Nashville, and some of them were there when General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. And then in the spring of 1865, peace at last. And the steamboats brought them back home, back to Fort Snelling. Some had gone away young and straight and strong, and now they were hobbling and feeble, eyes so dim and hair so gray their friends and their families scarcely recognized them. But they were back, back from 4 long years of war, Minnesota's marching men.
Yeah, I was just by the canteen, and there it was in big headlines. Them Spaniards blew up one of our battleships. Yeah, in the harbor at Havana, Cuba. Yeah, I've always wanted to meet a Spanish senorita.
The battleship Maine was blown up in 1898. Accounts of the plight of the Cubans under Spanish rule had been told in detail under blazing newspaper headlines. Americans, Minnesotans among the rest, were thoroughly aroused, thoroughly indignant against Spain. So when Congress passed a joint resolution on April 18, 1898, the people of Minnesota shared in the nation's excitement, and there was no lack of men to answer the federal call for troops from Minnesota. For some time, Minnesota's marching men had been drilling with National Guard units. On the 29th of April, 3 regiments of the Minnesota National Guard assembled in St. Paul and, cheered by enthusiastic crowds, marched to Camp Ramsey on the state fairgrounds. And during May, 12th, 13th, and 14th Minnesota volunteers. The 15th Regiment was called in July, and still more Minnesotans joined the Navy and the Marine Corps, and in other volunteer regiments recruited from the nation at large. Of the Minnesota regiments, only one, the 13th, saw foreign service in the Spanish-American War. Its commander, Colonel Charles M. Reed. Minnesota's marching men were landed, and on August 13th took part in the Battle of Manila. Some of them were at the head of General Arthur MacArthur's column as it moved along Passay Road. The story of the battle is preserved for us in accounts written by the men themselves. 2nd Lieutenant Carl L. Stone, Company F, 3rd Battalion.
When we were ordered up, we got into the swamp and the woods, and all the time under a heavy fire. As the Spaniards were firing high all the time, most of the firing was going over our heads. Fact is, it was not much of a fight. Only the absolute inability of the Spaniards to hit anything, except by the merest accident, prevented our regiment from being cut to pieces. We had to fire over 2,000 infantrymen and 5 field guns directed against us for 45 minutes. But we had only one fatality in the front line, the bugler, Archie Patterson.
For gallant and meritorious service in the campaign of Manila, Colonel Reeve was promoted to Brigadier General and was made Deputy Provost Marshal and Chief of Police for Manila. General Arthur MacArthur himself had words of praise for the Minnesotans in his official report.
The cool, determined, and sustained efforts of Colonel Reeve of the 13th Minnesota contributed very materially to the maintenance of the discipline and marked efficiency of his regiment. The splendid bravery of Captains Bjornstad and Seebach and Lieutenant Lacour, all wounded, and finally the work of the soldiers of the first firing line, all went to make up a rapid succession of individual actions of unusual merit.
And for 7 months, the 13th served as part of the Provost Guard for the city of Manila, subject to the constant danger of attack by insurgents. Open revolt broke out in February 1899, and the 13th was forced to increase its vigilance over the city. But at last, the 13th was ordered home. And what a welcome they received in St. Paul. The President of the United States, William McKinley himself, was there to greet them.
Governor Lind, Mayor Gray, members of the 13th Volunteer Regiment, and my fellow citizens. I have come from the capital of the nation that I might give the nation's welcome to a regiment of the nation's defenders. I have come to voice the love and gratitude of every American heart that loves the flag. I bid you welcome because you did your duty. And you have won high place in the hearts and affections of the American people, and gratitude that will continue for all time.
Though the other three Minnesota regiments saw no fighting during the Spanish-American War, they returned home and received rousing welcomes also. But bigger wars, more desperate fighting, loomed ahead for Minnesota's marching men.
You're listening to Minnesota's Marching Men, another chapter of Minnesota Milestones, over your Centennial station in Minneapolis and St. Paul, WCCO. Our friends at Twin City Federal reached quite a milestone recently, 35 years in the homes and savings business. And looking back, they were very gratified to learn that they had paid savers more than $43 million in dividends during that time. Looking at the present, they found resources had reached the $285 million mark. And looking to the future, they hope they can soon have the pleasure of serving you. The savings facilities at Twin City Federal offer you safety, service, and consistently generous dividends. Accounts are insured by a permanent agency of the United States government. The current dividend rate is 3.5% compounded quarterly, and that is the top rate in town on insured savings. And the service? Well, there's plenty of free parking for you right at the door. There are plenty of tellers' windows inside, and I know you'll find the folks at Twin City Federal courteous and helpful. Now, if you prefer to save by mail, a postcard addressed to me, Cedric Adams, here at WCCO, will bring you all the information you need. By mail or in person, you're cordially invited to get acquainted with Twin City Federal at your first opportunity. Twin City Federal, the $250 million Savings and Loan Association, where the twin clock flashes the time and the temperature.
Navy men from Minnesota were the first to receive the call to duty when the United States entered World War I. Congress approved American entry into the war on the 6th of April, 1917. 2 days later, the naval militia left Duluth for Philadelphia. And Minnesota's marching men began to assemble at the armories in the small towns and at Fort Snelling. The 4 Minnesota National Guard regiments recruited their forces to full strength. The infantry, an ambulance company, left for Camp Cody, New Mexico. The field artillery was sent to Camp Mills, New York, to become part of the 42nd, or Rainbow Division. 40,000 men from Minnesota enlisted in the regular forces. By the end of the war, nearly 75,000 men were drafted. And altogether, 118,000 Minnesotans, including 1,000 nurses, joined the marching men and women. 4 Minnesota combat units reached the front over there in France, where the weary, deadlocked armies battled in the trenches. The 6th Marine Regiment, the 151st Field Artillery, and the 88th Division and the 91st Division all saw service. But it was the 91st Division that was drawn into some of the heaviest drives. At first, the men from Minnesota looked at a battered no-man's land, a shambles of trenches and mud and trees blasted to jagged stumps, and they fought. They fought and helped capture the Saint Michel salient in the Argonne Forest. They helped stop the Germans at Chateau Thierry. They helped in the capture of Belleau Woods and Abu. All told, about 3,600 Minnesotans gave their lives in World War I, killed in action or died of wounds. Some were poisoned by German gas. The outfit that perhaps saw most action was the 151st Field Artillery. Its commander, Colonel George Leach, kept the diary of each day's events.
Sunday, July 28th, 1918. The aviators fly very low, and at one time one of them deliberately chased Captain Bradley and me around a tree. He was so close that we had the opportunity to empty our automatics at him, but the necessity of dodging his machine gun bullets hindered our marksmanship. Sunday, October 7th, 1918. The sun shone bright today, and I took a bath and changed my clothes. That's the first time I had them off since the middle of September. The Marines came in today. Tonight, the 1st Battalion was badly gassed, and 41 men and 5 officers were evacuated to the rear. This is getting to be a tough sector. Wednesday, November 6th, 1918. Frank McCormick, one of the youngest boys of my regiment, was evacuated to the hospital today from the effects of gas. I feel especially sorry for these kids when they're in trouble so far away from home. Monday, November 11th, 1918. The armistice is signed, and at 11 a.m. the firing ceased. Nothing impressed me so much as the absolute silence.
Yes, there was great rejoicing over there in the fields of Flanders when it was ended at last. But there were times, more than just a few times, too, when the leave-taking was difficult and tearful.
You know, Josette, I sure gotta admit this Paris is quite a town. I'm gonna miss it a lot. I sure will.
Oh, Bobby, I'm glad you like Paris. And when you go, I hope you remember it, always.
Oh, I will, Josette. I'll never forget Paris. I won't forget you either, and... Well, golly, there's something I gotta tell you, Josette. You knew, we both knew. Well, this is hard to say, but... Well, Josette, we got our orders. We're shipping out the day after tomorrow.
Oh, Bobby, so soon. The day after tomorrow? That's Thursday. I'm so happy for you, Bobby. I really am. You're going home. But...
Oh, holy smoke. We can't stand here. Hey, there's a bench over there. Come on. There. Yeah, then that's better. Here, take this hanky. It's bigger than the thing you've got.
It's like you said, Bobby. We both knew. We knew sometime.
Yeah. A couple of good-time Charlies. That's us. We both knew I'd be packing up and heading for home someday. But, well, we didn't figure on falling for each other. I guess that's about it, isn't it?
Yes, Bobby. That's about it.
Well, now. Well, hey, look. Well, let me talk to the CO or to the chaplain. I'll talk to somebody. Maybe we could get married, say tomorrow, and then I could send for you later.
Oh, Bobby!
The joy, the thankfulness that at last it was over gave way soon to a long wait for the men to return. And it was a long wait. The 151st did not return until May 8th, 1919, about 6 months after the armistice. And there were parades and shouting and speeches and bands and banquets all over again when the boys came home. Another well done for Minnesota's marching men.
1941, Pearl Harbor. Yes, men from Minnesota were there too, but months before, in 1940, we knew it was coming, World War II. America was hastening to build its defenses, and marching men sprang up everywhere, columns of them. At Fort Snelling at the University of Minnesota, ROTC, V-7s, V-12s, the Air Corps.
You had your breakfast in bed before, but you won't have it there anymore. This is the into the wild sky yonder, keep the wings level and true. If you've lived to be a gray-haired wonder, keep the nose out of the blue, out of the blue. Now, flying men, guarding the nation's border, we'll be there, followed by more. In echelon, we carry on, boy, nothing will stop the Army Air Corps.
Basic training, drill, KP, fatigues, 3-day pass, all became a part of the life of Minnesota's marching men. The war news those early days in 42 was bad, nearly all bad. Guam, Wake, and the Philippines all fell. Minnesotans waited for news from Bataan, from its 194th Tank Battalion, still holding out on the surrounded Bataan Peninsula. And in Colonel E.B. Miller's command was a captain from New Ulm.
Captain Willie Bold C. Bianchi, New Ulm, Minnesota, awarded the Medal of Honor for heroism on Bataan, Philippine Islands, February 3rd, 1942. Captain Bianchi silenced a Jap machine gun nest with hand grenades, and then, though wounded, manned a tank's anti-aircraft gun. Made prisoner by the Japanese, he was killed in January 1945 when American planes attacked the prison ship, taking him and others to Japan.
And in this war, total war, the women were asked to volunteer too, not only for nursing duty, but to join the WACs and the Waves, the WAFs and the SPARs. And a Minnesota girl, Hortense Bautel, was the first woman in the United States to be signed as a WAC.
The 18th Marine Battalion from Minneapolis was removed from Iceland and was made a part of the 2nd Marine Brigade, which fought at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, the long road back across the Pacific. And by 1942, Minnesota men in the Navy were serving in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. The 34th Division, Minnesota's marching men, left New York in January of 1942, bound for Ireland, and the 1st American Army Division to reach Europe. And the first man off the ship at Belfast, Ireland, on the 26th of January, was Private William H. Henke of Hutchinson. By the 10th of May, the entire 34th was in Ireland. And then the 1st Armored Division arrived to train with the 34th. The 34th sailed for North Africa, arriving there November of 1942. It fought at Oran in the Tunisian campaign, Kasserine Pass, Hill 609. The 175th Field Artillery of the 34th fired the first shot against the Germans in North Africa. And the 135th Infantry, another Minnesota National Guard outfit, fought all the way across North Africa, across the Mediterranean to Italy, and then the long, bitter, mud-slogging campaign up the Italian boot. The 34th moved on to Salerno, Anzio to Rome, and on into the Po Valley, and then out into the Pacific. We heard about task forces and beachheads and LSTs and foxholes.
You wouldn't recognize the neighborhood anymore, son. It's so quiet. No young people around at all. Your sister went to California last month and has a job in an aircraft plant. She's turned into a real Rosie the Riveter, I guess. Everything is rationed. Everything. Seems we never have enough red coupons to buy meat and butter. And when we do decide to splurge a little, I have to stand in line for an hour down at the market. Please, son, don't think I'm complaining, because I'm not. This is the least we can do. You and the millions of others like you, I know, are giving so much more. I try to imagine what it must be like where you are, but I fear it must at times be really worse than I can imagine. Oh, my boy, I hope this is a comfort to you, but there is not a day, not an hour in the day when your dad and I do not say a prayer for your safety, asking that God may watch over you and bring you back to us. And may it end soon, very soon. With all my love, your Mom.
And it was in another foxhole in Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands.
Hey, that's some screen those Japs are laying down.
You said it. And those guys don't seem to care much about living either.
You're telling me I emptied a whole clip into one of them before he'd lay down?
Hey, look out! It's a grenade!
Hey, get back! I got it!
Sergeant Richard K. Sorensen, Anoka, Minnesota, the second living enlisted Marine to win the Medal of Honor in World War II, and the first Minnesota enlisted serviceman to receive the honor in the last two wars. Sergeant Sorensen threw himself on a grenade in a foxhole during invasion of Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, February 2nd, 1944, thereby saving the lives of 5 men in the foxhole with him. Sergeant Sorensen was wounded in action.
And another Medal of Honor winner was Private First Class Richard E. Krause of the Marines. He lost his life on Peleliu Island in the Pacific, October 3rd, 1944. Like Sergeant Sorensen, he threw himself on a grenade to save the lives of 3 companions. And the marching men were at the Normandy beaches, D-Day, June 6, 1944. They fought across the hedgerows, were in the motorized caravans that sped through Paris, on across France to Belgium.
Back in the States, the parting, the kiss, was so tender. The promise, oh, I'll write you every day, Johnny. And she did at first. It could have come anywhere in the world. In France, in Luxembourg, in the Pacific, on a battle wagon, or at an air base in a remote corner of the world. It could come, and it did. The letter.
I realize it's been a long time since I have written, but I have been so busy. The gang, or what's left of it, still gets together for Saturday night at the Cozy Nook on the edge of town. We took the train into Minneapolis last weekend, and we had a swell time. I guess I've used the word we an awful lot in this letter. The we is Harry Olson and me. Do you remember him? The tall, curly-haired boy who lived at the other end of Main Street? He was 2 classes ahead of us in high school. I really don't know how to say this other than to just say it. Harry and I are engaged. We're going to be married next Friday. I'm sorry. I think this is the hardest letter I ever had to write, but I hope you'll try to think kindly of me. That's the way life is, I guess. Anyway, lots of luck, Ginny.
And it's December 1944, and the big news is the Battle of the Belgian Bulge, the Nazi breakthrough that threatened for a time all of the Allied gains in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge, men of the American Army trapped, encircled, fought like tigers. They fought across Europe with General Patton's clanking tank legions, leapfrogging across Germany, leaving behind the shattered remains of the Nazi army for mop-up crews later. That's where Sergeant Mike Colalilo of Duluth earned his Medal of Honor. Yes, they served in France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, and Austria. After VE Day, the war in Europe won, the marching men continued to fight on in the Pacific.
Mayday! 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 Jap Haruna-class battleship off the port bow. My right engine's fire. I'm gonna get 'em anyway.
Captain Richard E. Fleming, St. Paul, Minnesota, United States Marine Corps. Captain Fleming was the first Marine Corps flyer in World War II to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Captain Fleming lost his life in the Battle of Midway, June 1945.
In all, Minnesota had 9 Medal of Honor winners. More than 300,000 marching men and women from Minnesota served in the armed forces during World War II.
On a hot summer day on the deck of the battleship Missouri, with the scratching of a pen, it was over. The Japanese surrendered. World War II had been the most costly, the most bitter, the most deadly war in the history of the world. And Americans tried to go back, to settle down to the routines they had known before the war. The weekend warriors of the Navy, the Marines, and the Air Force reported at Wold Chamberlain Field. They flew their humdrum missions. Men reporting for training duty on the weekends, on drill nights at the Armory, to Camp Ripley and Camp McCoy in the summer. But on June 25th, 1950, there was a difference. The North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. It had come, the thing that most men prayed would never happen again. In August, the 4th Marine Infantry Battalion of Minnesota received its call to active duty. On December 15th, President Truman announced that the 47th Viking Division of the Minnesota National Guard would be called up, and they were sent to Camp Rucker, Alabama for training. Nearly 95,000 Minnesotans served in the armed forces during the Korean campaign. While overseas, many Minnesotans can remember landing at Pusan Harbor, Daejeon, Ganju, Incheon, Seoul, the march across the 38th parallel, the Yalu, and the Great Retreat in the winter of 1951. They said it wasn't a war. They called it a police action. But the marching men couldn't tell the difference. But there were differences. One of them, the blue and white UN flag over headquarters. Then, after 2 more years of mud and heat, snow and frostbite, after months of exasperating negotiation at Panmunjom, another group of Minnesota's marching men returned home. And in 1958, a Minnesotan, Minneapolis-born, is the commander of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization forces in Europe. He is General Lawrence Norstad. General Norstad rejected the old tripwire concept that used NATO to trigger United States nuclear retaliation. He explained, "What we need is a shield, not just a tripwire or a burglar alarm, but a shield of some reasonable strength. If the Russians meet resistance, they will have to consider the possibility of unleashing a full-scale nuclear war. The enemy must be kept in a position where he has to make the decision." Today, right now, it's a new world. Listen. Those are man-made satellites, and with them came new words. Sputnik, Vanguard, Explorer, Cape Canaveral, Countdown, Blastoff, Orbit, Apogee, and Perigee. The new terms of a new age. It is the world's hope that men will never march to war again. In that hope, and with that prayer, let us remember all of those who have gone before, from the disease-ridden pioneer days of Fort Snelling to the conflict in Korea. Let us pause to remember those who have served, living and dead. And here's a salute to all Minnesota's marching men. In this month of May, when we observe Memorial Day, and in this year of Minnesota's centennial celebration, we honor all who served, that we may enjoy the blessings of peace. And if it be the will of God, may the men of Minnesota never march again.